Welcome to the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research's Think and Drink series of virtual talks. We hope you're all as well and healthy as possible, given the state of the world in which we currently live. I'm Ken Giroux, a member of the steering committee for the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research. The title of tonight's conversation is Race, Protest, and Democracy. The intersection of these three topics has been front page news these past weeks, so tonight's conversation, I think, is very timely. In just a moment, I'll introduce tonight's moderator, who will introduce our speakers, but first, a couple of technical points for you in the audience. If you want to see all the speakers, you can press gallery view. You have an option to do that. If you press that button again, it acts as a toggle, and you will see just the person who's actually speaking. So as an audience member, you have that option. You can type comments and questions into the chat, which will be visible to everybody, including panelists, but also everybody in the audience. And you can also type questions into the Q&A, question and answer box, and there only the panelists will be able to see them. This summer and going on into the fall, it appears now, which is pretty exciting, we'll host these events every other week. So please join us again 2 weeks from tonight. The topic of our next conversation will be what we've lost, what we've found, 3 creative writers on responding to environmental change with Drew Lanham, Ann McCutcheon, and Janice Ray. If you want to keep in touch with us, you can send an email to humanities@uwyo.edu. In particular, an email to that will put you on our update list, our supporters list, and you'll get reminders of these and all other events as they come along. I will type that address into the chat box in just a moment. You can also see recordings of our past events on our YouTube channel. You can go to YouTube and search for Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research. I also will copy and paste the link, though, into the chat so you can snag it quickly if you want it. That's it for technicalities. Tonight's moderator is Dr. Scott Henkel, professor of English here at the University of Wyoming and director of the Humanities Research Institute, my boss, which is why I'm being polite and proper and respectful this evening. Please help me welcoming Dr. Henkel and our speakers.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. It is my great joy to introduce our 3 speakers tonight. We have Dr. Cedric De Leon, who is director of the UMass Amherst Labor Center and professor of sociology at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. His research is on race, labor, and party politics in the United States, India, and Turkey. He has written 5 books, including Crisis, When Political Parties Lose the Consent to Rule, and The Origins of Right to Work. In a previous life, he was an organizer, rank and file activist, and local union president in the American labor movement. And if I may interject ever so quickly, my brother Cedric, it's lovely to see you. I met Cedric way back in the day when we were union organizers together, and it's good to see you. Dr. De Leon's work as director of the UMass Amherst Labor Center has focused on recruiting students and faculty of color to the Labor Center, which is a training ground for the next generation of labor activists. His latest op-ed is titled, Police Violence in Minneapolis Affirms Why Cops Have No Place in the Labor Movement. Follow and message him on Twitter at prof_De Leon. That's PROF_DELEON. We also have Dr. Robin Spencer, who is a historian who focuses on Black social protest after World War II, urban and working class radicalism, and gender. In 2018 to 19, she was Women and Gender Studies visiting endowed chair at Brooklyn College at CUNY, and she is currently an associate professor of history at Lehman College. She has written widely about the Black freedom movement. Her book, The Revolution Has Come, Black Power, Gender, and the Black Panther Party in Oakland, was published in 2016. A truly great book. She's completing a new book titled To Build the World Anew, Black Liberation Politics and the Movement Against the Vietnam War, which explores how and why the anti-imperialist struggle for Vietnamese independence became a rallying point for US-based Black activists who were part of the freedom movement of the 1950s to the 1970s. She's committed to lifting up the history of radical Black women and their contributions to the Black freedom struggle. She's working on a biography of radical left psychotherapists Pat Robinson and Angela Davis, the activist individual that continues to speak to this new upsurge of activism in 2020. You can follow Dr. Spencer on Twitter at RaceWomanist. That's at RaceWomanist. And I'm also delighted to introduce Dr. Lilia Soto, one of my colleagues here at UW. Dr. Soto is Associate Professor of American Studies and Latino Studies at the University of Wyoming, with affiliations in the Gender and Women's Studies program and the International Studies program. She received her PhD in Comparative Ethnic Studies from the University of California, Berkeley in 2008. Currently, Soto is the Director of the Latino Studies program and Associate Director of the School of Culture, Gender, and Social Justice. From a historical and ethnographic position, her research focuses on comparative relational race and ethnic studies, transnational migration, identity formation, and the interconnectedness of time, place, age, gender, and sexuality. Dr. Soto's first book, titled Girlhood in the Borderlands, Mexican Teens Caught in the Crossroads of Migration, was published in 2018 by New York University Press in the Nation of Nations series. The book couples the temporalities of migration with age, gender, and sex as intersecting categories of analysis, and the bearing these have on the lived experiences of Mexican teenage girls raised in transnational families. Her second research project, currently in the works, traces the historical silencing of the Mexican presence from the Napa Valley narrative and its rippling effect in present-day Napa. Soto has been the recipient of the National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Seminar in 2015, the Ford Foundation Postdoctoral Fellowship in 2012 to 13, and the University of California President's Postdoctoral Fellowship 28 to 2010. So, welcome everyone. Our topic tonight is race, protest, and democracy. Please, friends, tell us about your research. Have the uprisings that we see right now influenced your work in some way?
You know, as you said, Scott, my training is in ethnic studies, and where social justice is always at the core, and decoloniality is always a goal. I look at, or in ethnic studies, we look at the way that race, gender, class, and coloniality, we look at those from an intersectional, transnational perspective, and those are part of the methods and theoretical framework that we employ in our work. And I think in different ways, Black Lives Matter, the uprisings, rebellions that we are witnessing right now are calling for that approach. They're asking for a radical shift in the way that we do things, the way that we think. And I think that the need for ethnic studies scholars and the continuation of ethnic studies scholarship is critical. And I, you know, like in terms of my current work and being trained in ethnic studies, I'm currently writing about race relations in the Napa Valley. And as you mentioned, the silences and erasures that have been produced in mainstream Napa Valley. And I say mainstream because the stories that have been silenced are stories that we know in my community, right? So they're only silenced to a particular, you know, community. So so I look at very different moments in the Napa Valley to apply that intersectional, transnational, decolonial methodology that I think this moment, uprising, rebellion is calling for. So a recent moment that I explore in my work is a particular program that was just eliminated. It's called the Legacy Youth Program. That was eliminated from the high school level, middle school and elementary school. And I can't help but wonder why the Napa Valley Unified School District would do that at this particular moment. So I think that in different ways that the rebellion uprisings that we're seeing are have to, like, we have to think about how these are shaping and influencing the way that we do our work. And in different ways, I think that the field of ethnic studies has been doing this for a long time, right?
Well, what I'll say is that my research focuses on resistance and resistance movements. And so it's been particularly moving, instructive, you know, just, I didn't even have the right words. I want to say deep. It's been deep to watch this rebellion unfold. I feel in some ways that it has pushed me towards a sense of urgency around my work and the work that I'm doing, especially thinking about Black anti-imperialism, the role that Black leftists in particular played at bringing together a coalition of people who were willing to take a stance against US foreign policy, and to go beyond that to envision maybe new global relationships. So I feel like there's a possibility that was generated that I'm intrigued in looking at the past. And I see this as a very sort of rich moment of opportunity. And I see all of the mechanisms and the wheels turning. So it's really, I think for me, giving me a sense of urgency around my work. Now, because my work also focuses on women, I have also felt a sense of urgency around just getting more stories out. I feel there's sometimes a lack of imagination about what resistance in the past looked like. Who are the people that we should draw upon as models, as inspiration for this moment? Even to think about the intellectual matter that's in circulation is something as simple as the quotations that were used, that were, you know, tossed around in terms of inspirational or guiding or instructive for this moment, coming from the same sort of great men, right? Despite all we know, despite all the books that have been written about all of the many women freedom fighters of all political spectrums, really, right? So for me, I have felt like it's been a sense of urgency to make sure that I'm doing everything I can to amplify the voices that are left voices, that are feminist voices, that are critiquing patriarchy as part of these movements, that are pivoting the center and making sure that we're also considering broad-based struggles and not leaving out communities from a sense of what we want from the future. Right, because I found myself just more and more aware that, wow, what Black feminists brought to the 60s was a sense of we have to think about our future differently. And we have to think about it in a way that allows for the voices and experiences and expressions of so many different types of people, more than we may even want to see.
Well, so as I argue in my, my book, Crisis, When Political Parties Lose the Consent to Rule, I see this moment as a crisis of hegemony, in which people have essentially withdrawn their consent to be ruled by an agenda that I call postracial neoliberalism. And postracial neoliberalism, as the name suggests, has two pillars. By postracial, what I mean is the idea that the civil rights movement solved all problems of racial inequity. And so, you know, people of color should not be pushing for any structural change to white privilege. They should just be happy with the fact that they have the juridical right to vote and to supposedly due process of law. And then the second pillar is neoliberalism, which is that, you know, the idea that the surest path to shared prosperity is the free market, unfettered by institutions like unions and government regulations and other mass movements that hold the wealthy and power accountable. So, you know, I see the movement for Black lives as part of the resistance to that once dominant set of ideas. And I see it, I see that resistance as including on the left, Occupy Wall Street, the Bernie Sanders campaign and the Arab Spring. And on the right, I see this in the sort of Eurosceptic, anti-trade, white nativist political tendencies that are sweeping the globe. So I don't actually see the movement for Black Lives as one movement or one uprising off on its own, but as part of a worldwide mass resistance to post-racial neoliberalism. And the question, for us moving forward, I think, is whether the rightward or the leftward resistance to post-racial neoliberalism will win out.
Let's build from that a little bit. What do you all see as lessons that the movement for Black Lives can learn from past movements? I mean, are there historical analogies that you see that are particularly instructive for our moment?
Well, building off what Cedric just said about the global context, right? Certainly in the 1960s, the political struggles on the ground were shaped by the US war in Vietnam. They were shaped by African decolonization. And, I think that the global uprising that we see is not simply solidarity with what's happening here, but a reflection, as Cedric points out, of just the same systemic tendencies, the same unaddressed needs, the same, Lilia mentioned decolonial, the same sort of attack on the realities, the continuing realities of colonialism in those locations, and even speaking to in our location as well. So thinking about, I think one of the lessons from the past for me is to look and analyze what's happening in a global framework, right? And not to see it as kind of manifestations of support for what's happening here, but also what I'm noticing is that in many of the places where these movements and rallies are happening, it's a racial reckoning for them as well. And it's about more than race. It's about how race is entwined with capitalism as well. So I feel like that's what we're seeing, and that's sort of a lesson from the past that I would like to see discussed more, I guess. Spike Lee's movie The Five Bloods came out in the midst of all of this, bringing back a little bit of that Vietnam context.
I was listening to a podcast. It's as I was driving to San Francisco earlier today, and it was Robin Kelly was at The Intercept, and he's writing or finished writing a book called Black Body Swinging. And in the book, he talks about how we could think about this uprising rebellion as a third reconstruction, and how it's different from the second, or the first, because we now know that things are not working, right? That despite whoever, is in the White House or whatever, that things are not working. So I think it's important to think about the legacy, and to also think about the shifts, that we have seen in the current moment, where we're at right now, and then also thinking about linking, making parallels or paying attention to the patterns that we continue to see in terms of, detaining people in at the border, for example, or the high number of indigenous peoples dying because of COVID-19. So I think it's important to also think about it and make those connections as well. But I do think that we need to think about this current moment in through a historical lens.
So the lesson that comes to mind for me is about white people, because I was reminded when I read this question about a legend in the labor movement, African-American labor activist named Bill Fletcher, who was executive assistant to the president of the AFL-CIO at one point, is no longer, but he was at a conference that we hosted called Labor in the Age of Trump at UMass Amherst a few years ago. And he was talking about this term ally, right? About white allies doing, doing support work for the Black freedom struggle. And what he said, which was really profound and has stayed with me since then, was that John Brown, who was the abolitionist that led the attack on Harper's Ferry back in the late 1850s, was not an ally. He was a comrade, right? And what that makes me think about it, and this, is that we need white comrades. We don't need just white allies. Allies are nice. I mean, people who are going to basically agree, with the kind of lowest common denominator reform projects like training and so forth in the police and the criminal justice system. But I feel like the lesson that I think about is that we need white people to be the John Browns to the contemporary abolitionist movement, right? And we don't even have to go all the way back to the 1850s for a model about how to do that. We can even talk about the baby boomers, a much reviled generation, but I think about heroes like, Marshall Gans, who was part of the Mississippi Freedom Project and worked under Bob Moses, and the folks over at the Highlander Institute, right? This idea of white comrades was really central to, for example, the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project, which was meant to, for those who don't remember, to register Black people to vote in the early 60s. And what they understood was that we needed to bring white college students from around the country in order to bring the law to the Jim Crow South, because the police there, the entire power structure there, wouldn't have thought twice about killing a Black body, but they would have thought twice and three times about doing that to a white person, right? White people sacrificing and putting their lives at risk, because that is what is going to make this movement create real, deep structural change. Black people put their lives on the line every day just by walking out the door, okay? And white people who don't have to worry about that, I think the primary lesson that comes to mind for me is that if they're going to join the movement for Black lives, they need to be able to do at least as much as what Black people have to live with on a daily basis in this country. So that's happening now. It's not that it's not happening. There's lots of really interesting kind of moments in which white comrades have basically put their bodies on the line in order to be part of this movement. But I think it can be more general across the movement.
So much great stuff. I mean, here at the Humanities Institute in Wyoming, we're big fans of Miles Horton and his book, The Long Road, and thinking about what the Highlander Center does. A great model, among other things. I mean, so much. I also love the metaphor of Reconstruction that Lilia mentioned, like a first Reconstruction after the Civil War, a second Reconstruction that was maybe the long Civil Rights Movement, and a third Reconstruction that we may very much hope for. Lily, you also mentioned the COVID pandemic. So we're in the midst of like two real serious upheavals. I mean, one is a pandemic, and two is the movement for Black lives and the uprisings. Do you three see these? I mean, do you see a relation? How are these working together? What are your thoughts over the confluence of those two things?
I think that one of the things that I'm, to think about too, is that when the pandemic began, we began to praise, rightly so, essential workers, doctors and nurses, farm workers, all the delivery, workers, grocery store clerks, all of those people who were putting their lives at risk. And we also began to see how COVID was affecting Black and brown bodies and Indigenous bodies at a much higher rate, right? So there's all these, so then those are like two things that we began to see, 3-4 months ago. and we also know, and that makes me really angry, right? And we also know that it is the poor, it is the poor peoples of color who will not be able to pay rent, or who are unable to practice social distancing, because practicing social distancing is a privilege in different ways. So I think all those things are connected, and I'm going to mention another podcast that I heard, where this historian, Dr. Keisha Blaine, mentioned that because of social distancing, that we thought there was going to be a break in terms of, state violence, right? So when we saw the video of George Floyd being killed exactly a month ago today, May 25th, that it was sort of like there's no pause to state violence, right? So then, given the conditions of Black and Brown and Indigenous bodies being dying because of COVID at a much higher rate, and what happened with George Floyd, these things are incredibly connected. So yes, we need to think about the what has led to what is happening right now, right?
Lily, you make me want to listen to podcasts. I don't listen to them that often.
This is The Intercept.
There's some good stuff going on in there.
Yeah, no, The Intercept has been having like great conversations. I wasn't familiar with Dr. Keisha Blaine, but she had such powerful she had such a powerful analysis that I was just like, oh my gosh. So when she said, like, we thought we were going to get a break, I was just like, whoa, that's incredibly powerful in terms of, there's no break when you're a target, when you're a target 24/7. You don't catch a break,
Definitely. What I wanted to add is Arundhati Roy called the COVID-19 pandemic a global MRI. And I feel like in some ways, the confluence of the uprising that we're living through and the global pandemic has brought together forces that in the previous phase, let's say if we go with the Reconstruction analysis, during the second Reconstruction, during the Black Freedom Movement that unfolded post-World War II, you didn't see the same sorts of things. So for example, now the issue of the environment, the issue of our food chain, the issue of labor and the conditions of workers, the issue of what's happening inside jails and prisons, and the fate in terms of health, in terms of life chances, in terms of injustice of the people who've been railroaded and kept in those cages, the interpersonal violence that was revealed when shelter at home orders revealed that not only did people not have houses or homes, but that home was a dangerous and violent place for too many people. All of those things were separate movements that activists had to work to sort of make inroads towards each other, right? In the 60s. In those ways, there was a struggle to let people understand that, yes, the environment is an issue that Black people need to be and are concerned about, that yes, we also need to be concerned about the food that we put in our body, right? Even though there were always people who were bringing all of those crossroads together. But here we are, and the pandemic has done that for us, right? In this moment, we cannot disentangle the environment from what's happening inside prisons, to our desire for better healthcare for all, to the food lines that we see happening, to the conditions of farm workers and other laborers, the people who are working inside meatpacking plants, front page, front of the news, in a way where that would have been like a separate issue or a side issue or a back issue. Now, all those issues of labor are all together in this movement. And that is what I see as kind of the big highway that has been created by the confluence of these things. No longer are we being told that, there's kind of just one little lens. If we tinker with this, that's that's enough. We know unemployment, you know, we have to be concerned about unemployment. We have to be concerned about health. We have to be concerned about all of these things. They're all interconnected, and nothing has brought that home like what we have gone through, you know, as a country over the last, you know, since the beginning of the year, we can say.
I actually, I see the confluence of these events in a way similar to Robin, where when she mentioned a few questions back about sort of like the intersection of race and capitalism, because when I think about the confluence of COVID and uprising now, I think about the confluence of deindustrialization and the leftward turn of the Black freedom struggle in the 60s, right? Because in both moments, you have these deep recessionary cuts. You have mass unemployment concentrated in working class communities of color, which in turn fuel mass mobilization and then also the state repression of those mass movements, including police violence. So when I think about the 60s, you know, I think about an era in which people were likewise withdrawing their consent to be ruled, but by a different agenda, which was the New Deal social contract, right? Which never actually delivered racial justice and was then, at that moment in the 60s, unraveling as good union jobs were being shipped off to the suburbs, to the Sun Belt, and eventually overseas. And likewise today, we have a pandemic whose bodily and I would say economic effects are being concentrated again in working class communities of color, also fueling mass mobilization, this time against police brutality and longstanding racial inequalities that were never actually addressed, despite, you know, the promise of a New Deal from the Obama administration. So that's what I really, when I think about the confluence, I also think historically. That's my instinct, and I think about the 60s.
Friends, I don't know. I have my window open right now, and I don't want to reveal live where I live exactly. But if you are here in Laramie, you might be able to hear out my window. The Black Lives Matter march goes right past where I'm recording. So maybe can the four of us like be silent for 1 second and see if we can pick up some of the chants? Can you hear? Yeah, they're right. I'm pointing over my computer screen, out my window, onto what is at the moment occupied space by the Black Lives Matter movement right here in Laramie, Wyoming. It's pretty cool. Maybe if they come a little bit closer, I'll let you know. So just a reminder, I'm going to invite people to type in questions and comments either into the chat or the Q&A. But I have a few more questions to ask before we go on to that. So we all are also academic workers. Oh, wait. I have been tremendously proud of my little Laramie community, which maybe does not have the greatest history of protests and marches, although it exists. It gives me great hope to see what I'm seeing out my window right now. So I'm going to combine my next question with one of the questions we got from Tina into the Q&A. So we are also workers. We are professors. We are researchers. And these uprisings will have an influence, no doubt, on what we do. And maybe I'm going to combine a couple of questions. One, have the uprisings influenced how you plan to teach in the fall? And like, what's the intersection of like your academic work with your maybe political work in the streets? What might you want to see from academic institutions at the moment? What has been the influence? Please.
So I'm teaching a political sociology course to doctoral students in sociology in the fall. And normally, this kind of course, because it's going to focus on the theme of power, would center on white intellectuals like Max Weber, Antonio Gramsci, Stephen Lukes, and Michel Foucault. And much of that would be focused on sort of soft power and persuasion, and particularly the ways in which we all sort of participate unwittingly in our own oppression. And I realized I don't really want to teach it like that. I want to argue that the reason why people focus on soft power and persuasion is because these theorists assume that liberal democracy did not and does not function by way of violence, and in particular racial violence. So what I want to do in the fall is I want to cover the European classics in the first half of the course, but in the second half of the course, I'm going to focus on critical race theory, the Black radical tradition, and the literature on white settler colonialism for insights into how liberal democracy, right, is actually underpinned by everyday racial violence. So I can talk about the different things that I would recommend UMass do, but just to be concrete, I think that's the way in which the uprisings have really sort of shifted what I'm going to be doing in what I teach in the fall.
I'm teaching 2 undergrad courses, and I'm teaching a graduate seminar, which is a core readings class for American Studies MAs. And I think that this moment has to influence the way that we teach. I think that we have to teach, we have to alter our teaching practices, and I think it's our responsibility to do so. So I always teach, and I make no apologies for it, I always teach scholars of color, American Studies scholars, ethnic studies scholars in my classes. And I want to continue to introduce more writings on being human and on humanity, right? I want to, in my core American Studies class, I want to add, more readings by Orlando Patterson, Slavery and Social Death, for example, or even the documentary I Am Not Your Negro as a text, right? As well, and also to teach from a relational perspective. So there was a newspaper article a few weeks ago that at an ICE detention center, the detainees had a hunger strike in support of Black Lives Matter. So also teach in a way that we can see more how these things are connected. And I think it has to. And I think at the core, ethnic studies is a decolonial project. And one of my mentors used to say that the goal of ethnic studies was to teach a different curriculum, to train a different kind of student and produce a different kind of humanity. And that's something that I take very seriously in my classes. In terms of what I would want the University of Wyoming to do, I mean, at the very least, what the University of Wyoming could do is to reinstate the diversity course requirement that was eliminated at the university level. We have it in A&S at the College of Arts and Sciences, but you can go 4 or 5 years at the University of Wyoming and not take any classes that has to do with race, ethnicity, or inequality, or anything that has to do with social justice. And I think that this is an opportunity for the University of Wyoming to think about what it is that we can do to change the curriculum to produce a new kind of humanity. And Wyoming does have a very interesting, diverse history that I think gets glossed over or erased. There's a Chinese massacre in Rock Springs. There's some the presence of Mexicans, Heart Mountain in internment camp during World War II. and then a clear, African American presence as well, and of course the Wind River Reservation for Arapahoes and Shoshones as well. So there's the history is there. So I think at the very least the university could be responsible and reinstate the diversity requirement to train a different kind of student.
Well, I won't be teaching in the fall because I'll be on leave, but I'll speak to maybe what I would like to see in terms of just in a bigger institutional sense. I teach at the City University of New York, Lehman College. Many people know it because it was, for so many years free. And it was really an education that made working class New Yorkers, Black and brown people, working class, ethnic immigrant, whites, whomever, gave them a quality education. And then when tuition was imposed, it really changed the face of CUNY. So right now there's movements to think about how to sort of point CUNY in a different way into the future. So what I would like to see is, of course, protections for our students who are the essential workers. CUNY, the CUNY that I'm at Lehman College, we're a so-called Hispanic serving institution, meaning that most of the student population are coming from, different countries, the Dominican Republic and so on. And, it would be great to think about how to provide them with the best education possible. There's been calls for all sorts of draconian cutbacks in the face of the economic crises in cities, and public universities and their budgets are the first, amongst the first to go. There's been, attempts at massive layoffs of CUNY professors, many of whom are on adjunct line or contingent, and thinking about ways to protect those workers and protecting the students as essential workers as well seems to be pivotal to me. Also thinking about defunding, what does defunding the police look like on campus? What's happening with the campus police? What's the relationship between the CUNY campus and the campus police in terms of the security, law and order, quote unquote? How does that come onto our campuses? And disentangling CUNY from the many ways that it is entangled with the surveillance, infrastructure that is another way and another site for the same students who are patrolled and policed in their neighborhoods to have that same experiences on our campuses. Very, 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 very essential. Each campus, I think, has their own iteration of this. Some campuses are struggling against a strong sense of Islamophobia and the ways that has had an impact on their population. So it may depend and shift based on where the CUNYs are, but I do feel like those are things to look at. And of course, strengthening the departments, which now are, I think every institution or every place has issued their statement of support for Black Lives Matter, for anti-racism, in ways that feel quite performative, when those very departments and programs that have been trying to create an intellectual space for those very ideas to contest whiteness in the academy have been marginalized by the very schools that are now happy to say that we support Black Lives Matter. Real support for ethnic studies, Black studies, Puerto Rican studies, institutionalized spaces, protecting those spaces, building up those spaces, LGBTQI+ institutions, thinking about how do we bring in or don't bring in Indigenous studies, into our campus curriculums. I mean, I feel like that kind of rethinking of the curriculum has to go on in this moment, because we see that the universities, it's almost like we're essential departments now, right? Just like the devalued but often talked about essential worker, now the folks in Black studies and all the other departments that were devalued, now all of a sudden they're essential, but they remain underfunded, underappreciated, and literally like stepped on for so many years in their existences in these institutions. So total rethinking and revamping of those relationships is definitely warranted in this moment.
how do you see the relationship between the uprisings and the upcoming election? Do you care about the election?
I do. I think elections matter. I think they matter a lot at a local level. I do think that part of the rage also that we see is because of what 45 has done, you know, in terms of being, you know, incredibly racist and offensive in so many different levels. The way that he defends and upholds white supremacy, even most recently, his rally in Oklahoma and all the problems that came around with that. So, you know, and I don't like Biden, you know, and I feel like I'm gonna have to vote for someone that I don't really, you know, that I don't really care to vote for, you know, that much. But I understand also what 45 has done, and also what's at stake. So yeah, it's depressing. It's incredibly depressing.
So I do care about the election, and I think, of course, that Donald Trump is a curse on this country, including the white workers he purports to represent. And I think that we would be much better served by someone else. But I'm afraid of this kind of what I call sort of white horse complex, where, you know, every election cycle, there is this kind of notion, right, that all we need to do is get somebody in the White House who agrees with us, and things will be so much better. And of course, that's simply not true. And, you know, if you look outside onto the streets of Laramie and in San Francisco and New York City and even little old Amherst, Massachusetts, what you'll find is that people are building their own mass movements. You know, it's trite to say this, but it is really true that we are the people we have been waiting for. We're not waiting for Joe Biden, right? It's only through our movements and struggles, right? And this has always been the case. It's always been because of our movements and struggles that we have set the public policy agenda for the next generation. And this time it has to be on the criminal justice system and mounting social inequality under neoliberalism, right? But we're not going to get there if we let electoral politics use up all of our energy and resources, right? I mean, I do a lot of work in Chicago, and I have lots of family in Chicago. And I remember going back there in 2008 and in 2012, and all of these sort of badass, like, mass movements, radical mass movements, basically put their agendas to the side in order to elect Barack Obama. And Barack Obama is better than Donald Trump, of course, but, like, you know, I don't think actually that's where change comes from. I think that change comes from, in every single major historical conjuncture in this country's history and in world history, from the bottom up. And so I do care about the election, but I really worry that we place too much importance in institutional politics.
Yes, it was, you know, just a few days ago, I mailed in my absentee ballot. I definitely care about voter suppression and the ways in which that has been enacted to silence the voice of too many communities. I care about the ways that so many people feel disaffected from the political system. But I think, like Cedric, I do feel like, you know, and like Lilia said as well, I felt like there was a disconnect, you know, when I would look at the television and, you know, the politicians would come out to address the crowds, and their solution was, well, you know, vote, get out of the streets and vote. I felt that was a bankrupt strategy. I feel like we should be in the streets and we should vote. Voting is a routine. It should be like, you know, your shots, you go, you vote, right? The question is, how else are you enacting politics on the other days of the year, right? In New York, in my district, Jamal Bowman just unseated a very hawkish Democrat, Elliot Engels. And just like the election of AOC, I think, you know, those local elections, those elections that sometimes don't gather the type of attention and mobilization as big national campaigns do, that those are very, very important, right? I think that thinking about ways that progressive people can get into different positions and have an impact on shifting some balances of power feels important. At the same time, I do feel like what I see in this movement unfolding now is multiple strategies unfolding on multiple levels, right? I think that the first time around that Black Lives Matter mobilized, you know, again, around election campaign and the question of who was going to meet with the candidate and who was getting invited here and there, it became something that derailed and shifted the movement away from the type of maybe grassroots gains and maybe organizational base building that could have been happening. I feel like now there's a sense of a many-pronged approach that focuses on electoral work on some level, but also other things going on as well. And I feel like, you know, this is the approach that will, you know, really lead us to that systemic change, right? Barbara Ransby, scholar, historian, activist, said in a recent article that we need to, I think she was quoting someone else too, it might've been Kathy Cohen, political scientist, cite Black women. She said, vote against 45, organize against Biden, right? This idea that it's not about your vote being the last thing we want you to do. Sometimes it feels like that, the pressure around voting, it's not the first or last thing we should do. It should be part of, you know, the engagement with remaking this democracy. I think there's a real moment of we the people here that we're having, and lots of really needed debate around what future are we moving towards.
So we have a bunch of questions, and I'm going to ask you panelists one more of my own while I sort of read through the questions from the audience and assemble them in some way. Are there, for you three, are there ideas or texts or quotes that you find are particularly valuable for the world in which we live?
So I want the labor movement to think about the place of police unions in our society. And so I would really like folks to reread or read for the first time the first chapter of Black Reconstruction by W.E.B. Du Bois. That chapter is called The Black Worker.
Yes.
And sorry.
No, I'm sorry, I just said yes, do that.
Okay. So on page 12, it reads, the system of slavery demanded a special police force, and such a force was made possible and unusually effective by the presence of the poor whites. This explains the difference between the slave revolts in the West Indies and the lack of effective revolt in the Southern United States. In the West Indies, the power over the slave was held by the whites and carried out by them and such Negroes as they could trust. In the South, on the other hand, the great planters formed proportionately quite as small a class, but they had singularly enough at their command some 5 million poor whites. That is, there were actually more white people to police the slaves than there were slaves, end quote. And I want folks to think about that, because there are 2 points that I'm thinking about here. The first is that the original police were the white slave patrols in the Old South. And I think that we need to really understand historically what the police are as an institution. And secondly, I want to say that I think what Du Bois is suggesting here is that all white people are meant to be deputized, whether they are police or not, to police and contain Black and brown people. That is an institutional legacy of racial slavery and colonialism. And it is what white people and all people in this moment need to finally and decisively reject.
I don't have a quote, I just have a phrase. Well, actually, Cedric, I was listening to Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Robin Kelly on a different podcast. And they were both talking about, this idea of how we are all deputized in some ways by calling the police, right? And Robin Kelly gave a brilliant analysis talking about how precisely what you just mentioned, like how the police began organized as a way to protect property, right? So what does it mean to abolish the police, or what does it mean to dismantle, the police, and what does it mean to think about property, in a different way? But I sorry, it's not that I'm in social media a lot, but a friend of mine posted something on social media, which is what I wanted to share. And it's a phrase by the Zapatistas, a pensamiento, like a thinking, a thought, that they use, that this friend of mine, my friend Roberto Hernandez, who's a associate professor of Chicano Studies at San Diego State University, wrote, and it's called Construir sin destruir, build without destroying, right? And it's not it's not about destroying monuments, like that's not what the quote is about, but it's building, coming together as a form of accompaniment, welcoming people who are now taking part of a movement and participating in a structure that has been in place for a very, very long time. And I think that idea of construir sin destruir is one that gives me like a lot of hope, and it gave me a lot to think about in terms of how I wanted to dialogue, or how I want to engage with others, my skepticism or my caution in terms of the things that I see that are taking place. So I just wanted to share that phrase, construir sin destruir, which I thought was really beautiful.
I wanted to share some words from Audrey Lord. She's actually somebody who I'm reading more about. I think she's somebody who has been widely mined for quotations, but oftentimes people don't read the full text of her speeches. So I was looking up one of her quotes, which is about movements not being single issue. And I found a beautiful speech about the 1960s. So I wanted to read part of it because she's talking about the 1960s. This speech was in the 80s. So she's reflecting back on the 60s. As a historian, it really struck me because learning from the past, thinking about the past, thinking about the present through the past is like, my bread and butter. But what she says here is about a sort of a cautionary tale about doing just that. She says, to learn from, well, maybe I'll start with this other quote before then. She says, to learn from their mistakes is not to lessen our debt to them, nor the hard work of becoming ourselves and effective. We do not have to romanticize our past in order to be aware of how it seeds our present. We do not have to suffer the waste of an amnesia that robs us of the lesson of the past, rather than permit us to read them with pride as well as deep understanding. I love this quotation because I'm constantly being asked about the present and the past, especially because I work on social movement organizations. So I'm always being asked, do we need a new SNCC? Do we need a new Black Panther Party? What would Malcolm say if he was here today? You know, these kind of questions. So I love that idea that, you know, we don't have to romanticize our past in order to be aware of how much it seeds our present, right? To think about our past and our present being still connected, but the idea that the people in the past had all the answers being problematized, that we should, in this moment, be thinking about quotations and bringing forth quotations from people who were involved in prior struggle seems problematic when we can also be, well, in exclusion of those voices of the young people who are engaged in the struggle in the moment and generating their own analyses and understandings of these moments. So I want to sort of use my quote to kind of have us think about young people, this generation of activists, as intellectuals, as people who are making meaning, who are putting out analyses that will help to define the future of what this moment means.
We have a question actually about young people, but we have several questions on the topic of structural change. And maybe is just we have one comment that got sent to the panelists from Maggie on the relation between the police and slave patrols. Maggie recommends Mindy Fullalov's new book, Enforcer to Guardians, just for people. I haven't seen that yet, but I'll check that out. So a couple questions on like structural change. Sue, for example, worries that we've been here before and we didn't have like deep fundamental structural change. So what in your judgment will it take to make like real lasting change broadly in the nation? Which might be, you know, to link up to another question, might be differentiated from like symbolic change that like looks good. I think, Robin, you mentioned like the things that are more like performative, that you're doing justice rather than actually doing justice. So what do you think? Structural change, question mark.
I actually think I have a very strong opinion on this, so you have to forgive me about it. But like, my feeling is that I'll say it this way. What I fear most about the movement for Black Lives is its co-optation by the Democratic Party. That's not to say that I won't vote Democratic in November. I will. But here's the thing. In order to make lasting structural change, mass movements need to maintain an arm's length relationship to the party system in order to keep the political class accountable to the people. Because what we know over history is that once you get sucked in to the Democratic Party, or by the way, either major party, you become what's called a captured constituency, which means you are unwanted by the opposition because they don't believe they'll ever get your vote. And you become completely ignored by your home party, right? Which assumes that you have nowhere else to go. I'm the director of the Labor Center, and that happened to the labor movement. So my hope, and I think this has the potential to lead to long-lasting structural change, is that the movement for Black Lives remains a powerful and politically independent movement.
I agree. And I think that there has to be deep questions asked and mobilization around what structures. I feel like systemic change feels like it's going to go the way of diversity. It's going to go the way perhaps of even intersectionality. It's becoming a buzzword, you know, that is being scooped out of meaning, whose meaning is being scooped out on a daily basis, even as people try to keep reasserting what that means. I think that at this moment, because of the economic crisis, the level of dissatisfaction, the economic dissatisfaction level is incredibly high. right? The failures of capitalism are, you know, evident, whether people understand it as that or not. And I think that it's provides space for people to come in and build in terms of education, in terms of envisioning alternatives. I feel there's hope in the mutual aid movement, which feels like it's something that's going on in a way, as long as it doesn't get, again, co-opted by the NGO complex, I think, which is also there hovering over that. But I think there is kind of all of these spaces that have been carved out where people have figured out how to help each other, to reach across humanity, to challenge individualism, to act collectively, to take care of each other, even in the types of movement that's happening on the streets, the types of protests that we're seeing, and then the behind the scenes protest that is going on, the way people are organizing political education, the way that people are organizing security, discipline, all of those things that maybe aren't as evident, but are happening behind the scenes. I feel like there's kind of structures that are put into place. And I think that this generation of activists is very aware of the potential co-optation of these structures, at least some, right? I think that we can definitely look at places like, you know, so-called post-apartheid South Africa, where, you know, movements have been, you know, totally co-opted by, you know, middle-class opportunity and economic gain and the vision of political power. But I feel like there's enough of the raw masses on the streets who are not going to take it, you know, who have a platform, who have a voice, who are able to use social media to get their analyses and voices out there. They're not dependent on any sort of filter from anyone to build their own constituencies and to determine movement direction. So there's a lot going on, and in that tumult, I feel like that's the potential. That is the systemic change potential, to connect that to an entity like the Movement for Black Lives. Because what I'm talking about is not, you know, is separate from that, but to maybe that movement for Black Lives, and then the movements that are happening outside of that movement, as well as perhaps even the global, right? The ways in which you have entities outside of the US who are bringing in the very real struggles that remain an issue and that remain flashpoints, like the issue of Palestine, the issue of Native peoples, the issues around, you know, oil extraction, water extraction, all of those things remain issues. And it may be comfortable to have mascots and other things, other changes be front page news, and the statues, they mean something, of course. But there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that I think is going to be a lot more durable.
I think I just wanted to add that I think that along with the, you know, will there be change, or what makes this different, you know, and I keep hearing that you know, from people that have been around for much longer than I have, that it feels different, you know. And I think that one of the things that, or what I just wanted to add too, is that I think we also have to check ourselves at an individual level. You know, what is it that what are some of the things that we're letting, that we're not holding people accountable for? And it's not about shaming people, but I think it's about, you know, calling people out, you know, checking your, you know, checking people's, you know, racism, or checking people when they're lacking humanity or sympathy or empathy, you know. And I think those are really simple things that, you know, maybe are not necessarily connected to structural change, but I think it's something that I've heard some people say, that now they're calling people out, or now, and it's not in an aggressive way, you know, but I think, I don't know, I think that if we begin to see each other, and I don't mean to be cheesy in any way, you know, but if we begin to see each other, you know, as humans, as human beings, then maybe we can continue to engage and dialogue with one another. And I wrestle with that a lot, because I tend to tune out things, you know, people that I don't agree with, or people that I don't necessarily care to listen to in different ways, but also like, what does it mean to hold each other, accountable? I don't know. I just wanted to add that.
So I'm going to maybe ask, we have one more question that I for sure want to ask, and then probably bring it to a close, maybe with one final question after that. There's a lot of just looking out my window a moment ago, it seems like in fact, I know the Laramie protests here, they're being organized by young people, which just that gets me right here. Frida asks, how do you talk with young people, teenagers, about what's possible for them to help accomplish? They've just had a front row seat to public education getting through a plague semester, and they're hungry. So how to talk with young people about the uprisings, et cetera.
Well, I've got one of those young people in my home. I've got a 14-year-old who is, going through a very rough sort of process, right? Of, I don't know what to call it, but it's a politicization process. And it's the process by which you're no longer afraid to, or willing to face the consequence of being a contrarian to your friends, which I think for a teenager is, difficult. So I think, yes, we have a generation of young people who are standing up and putting themselves out there, right, in very real ways. They're using social media in very savvy ways, in ways that have challenged people who have been critical about organizing on social media and what is it good for anyway. It's not face-to-face organizing. But if you think about what have the K-pop fans accomplished and what have other organized groups of teens done through TikTok, the app that we all now know about, and they'll probably migrate from once we figure it out into something else. But definitely, I think that people are looking to get engaged on all levels. One thing that's, I think, amazing about this generation of activists is that they're very interested in mentoring young people. There's all sorts of online educational opportunities that are happening. There's all sorts of seminars at all levels around what does defunding the police mean, for example? What is the history of policing? For example, what is the history that you have not been taught in schools? I think that this generation is also recognizing, as they have become educated outside of their school setting, about having a critical stance towards what their education has meant. And I think it's been very, very real, this sense of disposability and the realities of that. And what that means in people's lives, as well as a sense of power, perhaps, of how attention can be shifted, right? How you can capture the imagination of a people, how people will come out and support and keep coming out. I think there's been a lesson. I felt like almost, here's a historical analogy, but the Montgomery bus boycott, no one thought it would go on over a year. But I felt that sense of, wow, they're still out there. It's still happening. It's weeks, it's still, the pace has not dissipated. And I know it has not, despite the fact that the cameras have shifted elsewhere. But the fact that we're hearing, out your window, Scott, the voices of people speaks to tenacity, and it speaks to the ways that folks are moving from, yes, this one individual in this one case or this issue of defunding the police, to what's wrong with American society and what can I do about it? The sense that I can do something about it. And I think at a time when students have been separated from their, the classroom environment, distant from the teacher, which is sometimes a plus for people who were in educational environments that were challenging, that were racist, that were problematic. Even if home space is not safe or comfortable, I feel like the young people of today are taking what they can out of, making the materials that they have and making something beautiful.
I think I just wanted to, I mean, I don't have any kids, but so I do have friends that have, teenagers, and something that a really close friend of mine, she has two daughters who are half Mexican and half Black. And their young white friend wanted to go to a protest with them to Oakland. And my friend, her mother said, absolutely not. Will they take a bullet for you? Right.
Mhm.
And it made me realize at that point that even when we think about, of course I know this, that when we're thinking about protest, there's an element of whiteness and privilege as well, right? That my friend feared for her daughters. But anyway, I think what I just wanted to add is, maybe pointing the youth to other youth who have participated or who are participating in these movements, so that they can feel, I don't know, empowered in some way. I remember my niece, who's now 24, when she was 13, 14, none of this stuff, like in one ear out the other. But now as a 24-year-old, she's incredibly active and incredibly conscious. So I think that, I don't know, it comes in different ways. So I think I would just say, I would just add, like, listen to the youth, and also show them other examples of young people who are doing, who have been doing, who are participating, who have participated in different kinds of social movements, to see what they're capable of, or what one is capable of doing.
My mind goes to modeling the kind of person that I want to be, and the kind of political engagement that I want to be a part of. And so, I have a 9-year-old son, and, he doesn't have he's pretty sharp, but like, he just doesn't quite have the analysis yet. And he's going through this phase of sort of individuating from me and trying to be his own person. And, in that kind of situation, and I assume that it's true of being a teenager also, it's probably not a good idea to be too heavy-handed about insisting upon, particular kind of political engagement. And so I just model it. I bring them along to protests, or, I am politically engaged around him, and gently, in a way that I think is sinking in, he is understanding the stakes involved. He's a biracial kid and can pass for white. And I think that he's thinking about that now, which I think is really important and so precious a lesson. I also think about modeling mentoring, because somebody brought it up earlier. I think, Robin, you were talking about this generation of activists wanting to mentor even younger activists. And I think that's really crucial, right? I mean, how do you model care as a political activist in this world, right? Because I came up through the labor movement. When I was a union organizer, it was just like, people burned out because we had horrible models about how to be a union organizer. It was like, work 16 hours a day, burn yourself out, or you're not, you don't get it, right? And I think that there's certainly a level of commitment that we ought to model, but I think that we also need to model a kind of care and mentorship that, if we're really going to make serious structural change and build a movement that lasts, we need to develop and cultivate young people in a way that they will remain activists in the movement, right? So modeling is what I think about when I think about talking to young people.
That's great. I am going to gently move us into final thoughts for our conversation. I want to point out that Michelle in the comments writes, "Given what I'm seeing from our young people, I have great hope, and hope as adults we can celebrate and elevate their voices." And she writes, "Thank you for such a thought-provoking dialogue." So, I mean, let me call for final thoughts. I mean, I want my final thought to be one of the things that Robin said at the very start, which is this lovely question: what do we want from the future? I mean, this is like, I mean, it's on my mind, and thank you for asking it. But I mean, what final thoughts do you have about this topic, about anything of the many wonderful things that we've raised tonight, please?
I want to say thank you, first of all, for inviting me, and thank you to the co-panelists. I want to say that I'm surprised. I feel like this year has surprised me. I would have never, ever expected the types of change, the types of dialogue, the types of opening that has come out of the tragedy and the loss and the grief and the death and the mobilization and the protests and the hunger for change of so many people. And, you know, I used to say all the time, a new world is coming. You know, there's a beautiful quote by Arundhati Roy, you know, I can hear her breathing. On a quiet morning, I can hear her breathing. And I never truly, like, deep down in my heart believed it. Like, you know, and then I worked on the Panthers. I work on the Panthers, and one of their models is seize the time, right? And they talk about, you know, just the possibility of seeing a world changing around them. I feel like I'm seeing a world, the possibility of a world change around me, of proportions that I would not have imagined just a few months ago. And I am both saddened beyond belief by the level of violence and loss that has come along with this moment of reckoning. But I'm also feeling a sense of hope that some of the ugliness that has been revealed to be part of the realities of capitalism, that has become reveals a part of the realities of policing, the realities of poverty, all of those things that are now in sharp relief, that people won't just turn away and they'll be held accountable, and that things will change so that the resources that are available, and there's so many resources available in this country, can be made to create a better life for the majority. You know, I feel like, you know, that sense of hope is definitely what I'm coming away from in this moment. So I appreciate the chance to reflect on that with you all.
I just wanted to thank everyone as well. It was a pleasure meeting Cedric and Robin, and thank you, Scott, for the invitation. I think that final thoughts is, you know, for us to read more, to learn more, to engage more, to be better, you know, to be better humans, to be better at what we do. I don't know, to be humble, but also to be enraged. Those are some of the thoughts that I have. I have a mix of, like Robin, of sadness, of rage, and hope. So it's a really interesting. Those are really interesting feelings to embody at the same time, you know. So yeah. So those are my final words.
I want to thank my co-panelists too, and I want to thank Scott for inviting all of us to be together. And I think my final thought is only that, you know, it's really important for folks to hold the streets and to build movements and to resist the powers that be, but I also think that it's really vitally important for us to occasionally take a step back and reflect and engage in analysis and talk to one another about what thoughts and ideas we're bringing to the table as we engage in these political struggles and share our local struggles with one another. So I'm really grateful and appreciative of this space, you know, I hope we can do it again.
Me too. Thank you, you three. Oh my goodness. Thank you for your wisdom and your willingness to share it. I appreciate it deeply. Dr. Cedric De Leon and Robin Spencer and Lilia Soto, I appreciate so much that you were with us. And I hope everyone out there is as well as we could possibly be given the truly crazy state of the world in which we live.